The oldest political record on Earth begins with one forbidden claim: kingship descended from heaven. And that is why no one talks about it. When archaeologists first began exploring the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, expectations were modest. They assumed they would uncover evidence of a primitive early society, basic settlements, early agriculture, and simple attempts at recording information. And at first, that is exactly what the excavations revealed: clay tablets documenting grain distribution, livestock counts, trade records, and routine administrative activity. These early findings reflected what scholars expected from one of the world's earliest civilizations. But as the excavations expanded and thousands of tablets were translated and cataloged, researchers began encountering material that felt different, almost unsettling. Among the standard administrative records, there were texts that did not describe transactions or temple logistics. Instead, they described rulers, cities, dynasties, and events reaching back to an age far older than the archaeological record should allow. They described a world before history, and yet they did so with precision, structure, and intent. It was within this growing archive that the document now known as the Sumerian King List emerged. Fragments of this text were discovered in ancient centers of political and religious importance: Larsa, Nippur, Shuruppak, and Kish. Today, surviving copies are preserved in institutions such as the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford and the Istanbul Archaeology Museum. The most complete version, the Weld-Blundell Prism, sits in Oxford, quietly displayed, publicly accessible, yet rarely recognized for what it truly represents. The physical object itself is dated to around the early 2nd millennium BCE, but the history it records claims to stretch far deeper into the past. The most striking anomaly appears immediately. The text does not begin with farming villages or gradual social evolution. It begins with kings ruling for thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, of years. And then it presents a line that challenges the foundation of conventional history: when kingship descended from heaven, not emerged, not developed, not invented, descended. For mainstream historians, this line is interpreted symbolically, a poetic expression of divine legitimacy. According to academic convention, ancient rulers connected themselves to gods as a means of reinforcing power and authority. But the more I studied the structure of the King List, the harder it became to accept that explanation. The text is not written like a myth. It does not describe events through allegory or metaphor. Instead, it lists rulers, year lengths, and dynasties with the same administrative tone used for taxation and inventory. It reads more like a governmental archive than a religious hymn. To the scribes who carved these words into clay, this was not a symbolic story. It was a record. And there is another fact that cannot be ignored. This document predates the earliest known written biblical materials by centuries. Long before the stories of Genesis were written in Hebrew, the Sumerians were already documenting a flood, divine descent, and a structured timeline of rulers stretching back into an epoch the modern world does not acknowledge. So the real question becomes unavoidable. Were later civilizations copying these accounts? Were they preserving the memory of the same events? Or were they simply inheriting fragments of a forgotten past? The more I examined the evidence, the more one conclusion felt impossible to ignore, and I will state it clearly. I believe the beings described in this ancient record, those who descended from the sky and established kingship, were not symbolic. They were physical. They were real. They were extraterrestrial. The ancient Sumerians called them the Anunna, later known as the Anunnaki. If that is true, then the Sumerian King List is not merely a historical document. It is evidence. Evidence that civilization may not have arisen through isolated human development, but through intervention, which leads to a final and uncomfortable question. If this artifact exists, if it is acknowledged by museums and translated by scholars, then why do schools, textbooks, and institutions avoid discussing it openly? Why does one of the oldest recorded documents in human history remain almost entirely absent from public education? Is it simply inconvenient, or does it challenge the accepted narrative of human origin so profoundly that it is easier to leave it unexplored? Whatever the reason, one thing is already clear. This clay prism, ancient, silent, and undeniable, forces us to reconsider everything we think we know about where civilization began and who guided its first steps. There is a moment in the Sumerian King List where the tone shifts from administrative record to something far more profound. It happens in the very first line of the narrative, a line carved not for poetry, but for memory. The text states, "After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." For scholars, this phrasing has generated decades of debate. But before interpretation, the fact remains, this is the earliest known sentence in human history describing the origin of political authority. And according to the ancient scribes, it did not begin on earth. In academic circles, this phrase is typically described as symbolic, a literary expression meant to convey divine legitimacy. The idea, scholars argue, is simple. Rulers were believed to govern by permission of the gods, and claiming heavenly authority reinforced power, obedience, and hierarchy. In this interpretation, divine descent was not literal, but ideological, functioning as theology rather than testimony. Yet when I examine the structure of the text, the symbolic explanation starts to feel insufficient. The sentence is direct. It does not speak in metaphor or prayer. It does not invoke mythic imagery or divine praise. It states an event, one with a sequence, location, and consequence. Kingship originated above, and then it was established in a specific city, Eridu, the oldest known urban settlement in southern Mesopotamia. And this opens a question that mainstream scholarship carefully avoids. Why would one of humanity's oldest recorded documents describe the beginning of civilization not as a human achievement, but as the arrival of authority from the sky? The phrasing is not vague. The scribes could have written that the people chose a leader, that the gods inspired rule, or that society evolved toward hierarchy. Instead, they recorded descent, arrival, transfer from a source not on earth. When I compare the tone of this line to later parts of the King List, the contrast is striking. The administrative sections are careful, structured, and formal. Cities are listed. Reign lengths are recorded. Dynasties shift logically from one seat of power to another. Nothing about the presentation suggests metaphorical intent. It reads like a chronological archive, not a mythic hymn. If this line were isolated, perhaps it could be dismissed as ceremonial language. But it isn't. Across the ancient world, the same theme repeats. Authority, knowledge, and order are described as coming from above. In ancient Egypt, rulers traced their origins to a remote epoch known as Zep Tepi, the first time, when gods ruled before humans. In early China, the emperor was known as the Son of Heaven, a being whose right to rule descended from the sky. Among the Maya and Olmec, celestial beings are credited with bringing knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, and kingship. Even traditions among the Dogon of Mali speak of teachers descending from a celestial system long before modern astronomy identified Sirius B. These parallels do not prove anything by themselves, but they do establish a pattern. Civilizations separated by geography, culture, and time all preserved a memory of rule, order, and knowledge originating somewhere beyond the earth. And so, I have to be honest in my interpretation. To me, this phrase in the Sumerian King List does not read like symbolism. It reads like a statement of origin, one preserved so carefully that generation after generation copied it onto clay as the foundation of history. If kingship descended from heaven, then whoever ruled first was not merely human. The earliest kings may have been beings whose authority, lifespan, and presence differed entirely from ours, beings remembered not as legends, but as the first rulers of Earth. This line is not just an introduction to a historical document. It is a threshold. It marks the moment where human history begins, not through human innovation, but through an encounter. And if the first kings truly came from the sky, then the story that follows, the rulers with impossible lifespans, the flood that marks a rupture between worlds, and the rise of human dynasties, may not be myth at all. It may be memory, a memory of descent, a memory of contact, a memory of the moment civilization began, not alone, but under guidance from beings who did not originate here. When the Sumerian scribes recorded the earliest rulers of Earth, they did not begin with modest reigns or lifespans that resemble anything human. Instead, they described an age where rulers governed for tens of thousands of years, an era so alien to our understanding of history that many researchers instinctively dismiss it as myth. Yet the numbers are not random. They are precise, consistent, and deliberately preserved through multiple copies of the Sumerian King List. The first ruler named is Alulim of Eridu. According to the text, he ruled for 28,800 years. After him came Alalgar, 36,000 years. As the kingship moved from Eridu to Bad Tabira, reigns continued at similar scales. Enmen-Lu'ana ruled 43,200 years, Enmen-Gal-Ana for 28,800 years, and Dumuzid the shepherd for 36,000 years. Then came the kings of Larak, Sipar, and finally Shuruppak, the last of the pre-flood rulers, Ubaratutu, whose reign lasted 18,600 years. In total, 8 kings ruled 5 cities across a span of 241,200 years. And only then does the text say, "Then the flood swept over." For mainstream historians, these numbers are the immediate barrier to taking the early part of the King List seriously. Many argue that the durations reflect symbolic numerology, scribal exaggeration, or misunderstood units from the sexagesimal mathematical system used by the Sumerians. Others suggest these kings represent eras, dynastic metaphors, or mythic archetypes rather than individual rulers. The academic consensus is that the antediluvian section belongs to legend, while the later portions gradually merge into verifiable history. But when I look at the antediluvian portion closely, the rationalizations feel like attempts to soften an uncomfortable truth rather than explain it. If the numbers were symbolic, why preserve them with such precision? Why repeat them across tablets separated by time, geography, and political agendas? And why list these rulers in the same format later used for unquestionably historical kings, with names, cities, succession order, and reign lengths? What stands out even more is the radical transition after the flood. The moment the deluge appears in the text, reigns collapse from tens of thousands of years to hundreds, then eventually to spans familiar in human lifetimes. This is not a gradual scaling down. It is an abrupt rupture. Something, whether environmental, biological, or civilizational, changed dramatically. Whatever governed the pre-flood world did not survive it unchanged. The names themselves offer another clue. Ubaratutu, the last king before the flood, appears in later Mesopotamian tradition as the father of the figure known in Akkadian texts as Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Deluge in the Epic of Gilgamesh. That overlap suggests that the King List and mythological literature share a common memory rather than independent invention. The pre-flood world was not imagined. It was remembered. So what are we looking at? Were these numbers mistakes? Were the early kings fictional characters inflated through myth? Or were they rulers of a different kind, beings whose biological reality did not resemble ours? If kingship truly descended from the heavens, as the previous chapter demonstrated, then the rulers who held authority before the flood may not have been human at all. To me, the consistency of these extraordinary lifespans across multiple versions of the text points toward intention, not error. The scribes were not confused. They were recording a world that operated under different rules, a world that ended suddenly with a cataclysm. When the flood swept over, an age closed. The long-living rulers disappeared and a new era began, one in which humanity took center stage. The contrast between these two epochs is not subtle. It is structural, mathematical, and absolute. The tablet remembers a time when rulers existed who were ancient even by ancient standards, rulers whose presence stretched across millennia, not decades. And the Sumerians did not treat that age as myth. They preserved it as the beginning of history. If these rulers truly lived for thousands of years, then humanity did not begin alone. We inherited a world shaped by beings whose timelines and identities remain far beyond the limits of what conventional history accepts, and perhaps beyond the boundaries of what traditional archaeology is willing to confront. There is a point in the Sumerian King List where the narrative shifts with a single, stark sentence. Then the flood swept over. No elaboration, no metaphor, no mythic embellishment, just a boundary line. Everything before belongs to one world. Everything after belongs to another. For the ancient scribes, this event was not symbolic. It was the dividing line between eras, the moment when an age of long-lived rulers vanished and a new, fragile human history began. Mesopotamian literature repeats this theme with remarkable consistency. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods decide to erase life through a deluge that engulfs the land. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood is retold by Utnapishtim, the lone survivor chosen to preserve life aboard a vessel. The Sumerian tradition names this survivor Ziusudra, a righteous king warned of the coming waters. These stories do not appear as local folklore or isolated myth. They form part of a structured memory, one deeply embedded in the earliest written culture on Earth. The more I study these sources, the more difficult it becomes to treat the flood as purely mythological. The King List does not describe it as a symbolic cleansing or spiritual allegory. It treats the flood as an event that erased a real civilization. Before it, rulers lived for tens of thousands of years. After it, lifespans collapsed to scales recognizable in human biology. That abrupt shift, both in chronology and in the nature of rulership, suggests a break far more profound than a literary transition. Scientists have long debated whether a real event could lie behind the world's flood traditions. Some researchers point to the end of the last ice age, when rapid climate change and melting ice sheets caused massive sea level rise. Others focus on sudden geological events, such as the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, proposing that around 5,600 BCE, rising Mediterranean waters breached a natural barrier and flooded what had been a freshwater basin. If such an event occurred suddenly enough, it would have erased settlements, displaced populations, and left a trauma capable of echoing through millennia. The scientific community remains divided. Some argue the evidence supports catastrophic flooding. Others insist the geological record points to slower environmental changes. Yet regardless of academic disagreement, one fact remains striking. Flood narratives appear across the globe with remarkable thematic consistency. In regions as distant as Mesopotamia, India, Mesoamerica, Australia, and the Arctic, the same pattern emerges. A warning from the sky, rising waters, a vessel of survival, and a world reborn. Parallel stories do not prove a single global event, but they do suggest that ancient humanity carried a memory of water as destruction, on a scale large enough to fracture societies and rewrite origin stories. That shared memory is difficult to attribute to coincidence alone. From the perspective of the King List, the flood mark is not simply a chronological reference, it is a civilizational reset. The rulers before the event belong to a different order, beings whose reign durations defy biological possibility. After the flood, leadership reappears in Kish, and the world becomes recognizably human. Cities grow, dynasties rise and fall, lifespans shorten. Kingship becomes less cosmic and more administrative. So the question becomes unavoidable. What changed? Was the flood a natural catastrophe that erased an advanced society? Was it a local disaster later mythologized into a universal story? Or was it something more? The end of an age ruled by beings unlike us and the beginning of a world governed by their successors. I cannot ignore the pattern. The oldest written record humanity possesses remembers a rupture, not gradual development. Something happened, something powerful enough to close one chapter of existence and open another. To the ancient scribes, the world before and after the flood were not the same. Not in rulers, not in lifespans, not in the nature of kingship itself. The flood stands as the boundary between two histories, one nearly incomprehensible, the other familiar. If the memory is accurate, then what we call civilization may not be the first version of human society, but the second, a reconstruction after a forgotten catastrophe. And that possibility changes everything. When the Sumerian King List emerges from the silence of the flood, the world it describes is no longer the same. The long-lived rulers of the antediluvian age disappear, and a new order begins. The text states, "After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven for the second time, the kingship was in Kish." This sentence marks the beginning of a fundamentally different chapter in Earth's recorded past. One defined not by ageless beings, but by mortal kings ruling under an inherited system. What stands out immediately is the shift in the nature of time. Before the flood, rulers governed for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reigns shrink dramatically, still long compared to modern standards, but unmistakably bounded. The first ruler of this new era, Jushur of Kish, is recorded as ruling for 1,200 years. His successors see further reductions. Within only a few generations, reign lengths fall into ranges we can comprehend. Centuries, then decades. It is as if the world recalibrated itself, or as if a new kind of ruler took the throne. And here, something remarkable happens. Archaeology steps into the story. Among the rulers of Kish appears a name also found in independent inscriptions, Enmebaragesi. His existence is not confined to mythology or literary tradition. His name survives carved into stone artifacts recovered from Mesopotamian soil. This makes him one of the earliest historically verified kings known to humanity. The King List, at this point, ceases to be merely an ancient record. It becomes a bridge, connecting memory to material evidence. Another familiar name appears not long after, Gilgamesh. In the King List, he is a ruler of Uruk. In later literature, he becomes a central figure, part hero, part king, part myth. The Epic of Gilgamesh remembers him as a being of mixed origin, not divine, yet not fully ordinary. His story reflects a world still close to a time when rulers walked among gods, yet firmly rooted in a human trajectory. The transition is clear. The distant age of impossible lifespans has ended, but its echo remains. As this new era unfolds, cities rise quickly across southern Mesopotamia. Kish, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, names that later history will remember as foundational, grow into administrative and religious centers. Their architecture changes. Defensive walls appear. Irrigation systems expand. Bureaucracy becomes formal. Writing shifts from symbolic imagery to structured cuneiform, not slowly, but with an abruptness that challenges evolutionary models of cultural development. Central to this transformation are temples. In this post-flood age, the temple becomes the heart of society, the place where economy, ritual, and power converge. Priests and kings share authority. One governs the material world, the other maintains the connection to the divine. And unlike the rulers before the flood, these kings do not claim to be gods themselves. Instead, they rule for the gods, as custodians of a kingship that did not originate with them. This distinction reveals the deepest shift recorded in the King List. Before the flood, rulers appear as beings closely associated with the heavens, perhaps even originating from them. After the flood, rulers are unmistakably human. The system remains, but the species in power changes. The text preserves this shift without commentary, almost as if the scribes expected their audience to recognize the difference instinctively. Archaeological discoveries support the same pattern. Administrative tablets, ration records, early training exercises for scribes, these artifacts appear suddenly and fully formed. There is no gradual buildup of archaic proto-writing or fragmented governance. Civilization restarts with structure already intact, as though the blueprints existed long before the hands that carried them. And this raises an unavoidable question. Was civilization reinvented after the flood, or was it resumed? The King List implies continuity, not invention. The office of kingship descends again, but the nature of the rulers changes. The pre-flood beings do not return, yet their system, their cities, and their memory remain. If they once governed the world directly, this second phase suggests withdrawal, a shift from presence to oversight. To me, the pattern is clear. Humanity did not emerge from the flood as a primitive species struggling to rebuild. It emerged with knowledge, architecture, writing, administration, astronomy, agriculture, already encoded into its institutions. This does not resemble a beginning. It resembles inheritance. The post-flood kings mark the point where human history becomes recognizable, ruled by mortal hands, yet still shadowed by a lineage that did not originate on Earth. The flood may have erased the first civilization, but it did not erase the idea of kingship. That idea survived because someone intended it to. When the Sumerian King List moves from mythic memory into the post-flood world, something extraordinary happens. Civilization does not evolve slowly. It does not unfold gradually from simple villages into complex states. Instead, the archaeological record in Mesopotamia reveals a sudden, coordinated emergence of writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, architecture, agriculture, and governance, as though an entire framework of civilization appeared already designed. In standard historical models, cultures progress through predictable stages. Small hunter-gatherer groups settle into villages, begin basic farming, develop simple symbols or tokens, and over millennia refine these into writing, government, and urban complexity. Yet in southern Mesopotamia, that staircase is missing. What we see instead is a civilization that emerges fully structured, with scribes, irrigation systems, temples, administrative records, and urban planning already functioning. There is no experimental phase, no clear prototype society demonstrating the gradual invention of these systems. The earliest evidence appears advanced. Writing is one of the clearest examples of this abrupt leap. The earliest proto-cuneiform tablets from Uruk are not artistic symbols or personal inscriptions. They are administrative records, accounting documents, grain tallies, labor agreements. Even at its origin, writing behaves as an institutional tool for managing a complex economy. And within only a few centuries, this system evolves into full cuneiform, phonetic encoding, grammar, abstract vocabulary. The transition is so rapid that it challenges the idea of writing as a long developmental experiment. It behaves instead like a system applied to a society that already needed it. Mathematics follows the same pattern. The Sumerian numerical system was not primitive counting based on simple marks. It was sexagesimal, base 60, a framework still embedded in modern clocks, navigation, and geometry. This system included positional notation, reciprocals, and geometric computation used in surveying, temple construction, and astronomy. No earlier culture has been found demonstrating the mathematical prototypes that should precede such a sophisticated system. Its structure implies intention, not accidental innovation. Astronomy adds another layer to the mystery. Early Mesopotamian tablets record celestial cycles, lunar calendars, planetary motions, and ritual timing with a precision that seems excessive for an emerging agricultural society. Venus cycles, equinox observations, and complex calendrical systems appear far earlier than expected. For a civilization just beginning to form cities, the level of astronomical awareness is disproportionate, unless the knowledge predated the society using it. Law and social order emerge with the same abrupt maturity. The Code of Ur-Nammu, among the earliest known written legal systems, establishes structured rules for property, inheritance, contracts, penalties, and social hierarchy. It assumes bureaucracy, literacy, judicial authority, and long-term stability. Legal codes do not normally emerge at the beginning of civilization, yet in Mesopotamia, they do. Architecture reinforces the pattern. Within the early post-flood period, monumental structures such as ziggurats appear, requiring logistics, engineering, labor organization, mathematics, and architectural planning. These buildings were not improvised. They were conceived, designed, and constructed with advanced coordination. Irrigation canals, agricultural grids, and city layouts appear with similar intentionality. Across every field, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, architecture, agriculture, the same phenomenon repeats. The first appearance is not primitive, it is refined. Mainstream scholarship explains this acceleration through population density, environmental pressures, and social specialization. But those explanations struggle to account for the coherence and synchronicity of the development, and especially the absence of transitional forms. For me, the pattern echoes the structure of the Sumerian King List itself. After the flood, kingship, and with it, organization, descends again. Civilization restarts not as an invention, but as a continuation. The systems that appear in Mesopotamia do not behave like discoveries. They behave like inherited knowledge, knowledge too advanced to be the product of a newly emerging society. The more I study the archaeology, the more one conclusion becomes difficult to avoid. Humanity did not gradually learn how to build civilization. It began with civilization already mapped. Something, or someone, provided the framework. And if the earliest written memory humanity preserved tells us that kingship descended from the sky, then the sudden birth of civilization may not be a coincidence. It may be evidence, a blueprint handed down, a restart, not a beginning. At this point in the story, a question begins to form, quietly yet persistently. If civilization after the flood emerged so suddenly, if writing, astronomy, mathematics, and kingship returned not as inventions but as restorations, then where did this knowledge originate? Ancient Mesopotamian texts offer a clue, but it is written not in equations or excavated walls. It is carved into mythology. Repeatedly, consistently, across tablets and ritual hymns, one idea appears. Power comes from the heavens. Kingship descends from the sky. The rulers of the earliest age are remembered not as human beings, but as beings of divine or celestial origin. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the sky was not symbolic. The heavens were the dwelling place of the gods, a literal domain with structure, order, and hierarchy. Anu, the great sky father, ruled from the celestial realms. Inanna embodied Venus, Shamash embodied the sun, Nana embodied the moon, not as metaphors, but as direct identities. The earliest cultures did not imagine the gods as abstractions or spiritual metaphors. They saw them as real entities connected with the stars. Across the ancient world, this pattern repeats. The oldest religions do not place their gods underground, nor in trees, nor in rivers. They place them in the heavens, beyond the earth, beyond the known. And throughout the ancient texts of Mesopotamia, a recurring phrase appears: kingship descended from heaven. This line is not poetic, it is descriptive. Something, or someone, came down. Once this lens is applied, the anomalies of early civilization begin to align. The sudden appearance of writing no longer looks accidental. It looks instructed. The advanced base 60 mathematics no longer feels like the work of agricultural experimentation. It feels inherited. The early astronomers tracking celestial cycles with precision beyond subsistence needs begin to resemble observers honoring a memory, or studying those who once ruled from above. Even myth supports the pattern. Divine descent is not a rare exception. It is the foundation of early cosmology. Gods descend, interact with humanity, grant knowledge, establish order, and shape kingship. Inanna descends, Shamash descends. The Apkallu, wise beings often depicted with wings or strange, non-human features, descend to instruct early rulers. These stories are found not only in Mesopotamia, but in Greece, Egypt, Mesoamerica, Polynesia, and the Andes. Cultures separated by oceans, languages, and time share a single memory. Knowledge came from the sky. There is a name for this possibility, a hypothesis considered controversial, sometimes dismissed, often avoided. The idea that the earliest gods were not mythological spirits, but visitors from beyond Earth. In this interpretation, the beings recorded in ancient texts were not supernatural deities, but advanced intelligences, bearers of knowledge, technology, and structure who interacted with early humanity in a time now blurred by memory and myth. Under this view, the post-flood restart described in the Sumerian King List becomes clearer. Civilization did not rebuild itself. It was reactivated. Kingship did not evolve. It returned. The blueprint of order, writing, astronomy, mathematics, architecture, did not arise from experimentation. It was given. This hypothesis does not claim certainty. It does not erase human genius or diminish human legacy. Instead, it reframes humanity as an inheritor, a species chosen, instructed, and eventually left to develop independently. It honors what the ancient scribes preserved: the memory of a world where the boundary between earth and sky was not silence, but interaction. Of course, this interpretation carries weight and controversy. Mainstream academia rejects it, noting that no artifact, no biological sample, no conclusive physical evidence confirms extraterrestrial involvement. Myth alone cannot prove history. Similarities across cultures may arise from parallel imagination, not shared experience. These objections matter, and they must remain present. Yet the unanswered questions remain just as persistent. Why does civilization appear fully formed? Why does writing begin advanced? Why does mathematics begin cosmic? Why do the oldest religious systems identify gods with stars, planets, and celestial movement? Why do flood narratives, sky gods, and civilizing visitors appear across cultures separated by thousands of miles and millennia? The ancient texts do not whisper. They speak clearly. Something came before us, and something intervened. Perhaps the gods were never gods at all. Perhaps they were visitors, teachers, custodians of knowledge. Perhaps humanity did not begin alone. And perhaps the tablets, myths, and temples are not fiction, but memory. The Sumerian King List is one of the oldest written historical records in existence. yet almost no one outside academic circles has heard of it. Museums rarely display it prominently. Schools never mention it. And popular history treats it as an odd mythological curiosity rather than a foundational document. The question is simple, yet unsettling. Why? Part of the answer lies in the story the King List tells. It does not follow the familiar narrative taught in modern education, the slow climb from primitive hunter-gatherers to organized agriculture, then to writing, cities, and states. Instead, it describes something entirely different. It claims that kingship arrived fully formed, descending from the sky. It speaks of rulers whose lifespans stretch into thousands of years, and it declares that a catastrophic flood erased one world and gave rise to another. This version of history does not evolve. It resets. Such a narrative does not fit within the accepted model of human development. Modern frameworks depend on linear progress, a slow, predictable climb from simplicity to complexity. The King List refuses to behave that way. It suggests intervention, structure, and intentionality. For that reason alone, it is easier to sideline than to confront. There is another problem: the numbers. Reigns lasting 28,000 years challenge every biological assumption about human existence. Instead of asking what those numbers represent, scholarship often neutralizes them with labels: symbolic, allegorical, exaggerated, ritualistic. With one word, the impossible becomes ignorable. The text becomes harmless. But ignoring something does not make it disappear. The King List continues to sit in museums, real clay, real writing, real history, silently contradicting everything assumed about the origins of civilization. If taken seriously, its implications ripple far beyond archaeology. A real historical flood challenges scientific chronology and strengthens ancient global memory. The sudden reappearance of advanced knowledge after that flood forces reconsideration of how civilization began. And the repeated insistence that kingship arrived from the heavens opens a door most institutions prefer to keep closed. Some may avoid this not because of conspiracy, but because of stability. A world built on traditional academic models, national origin stories, religious doctrine, and scientific certainty does not welcome narratives that rewrite foundations. Questioning the origin of civilization disrupts more than textbooks. It disrupts identity. And societies protect identity fiercely. Yet the silence carries weight. The King List exists. It is not fiction, not mistranslated legend, not a vague oral tradition. It is a written document created by ancient scribes whose purpose was to record memory, not imagination. And in that memory, something extraordinary happened. Kingship descended from the sky. That is why this matters. And that is why it is avoided. The next question becomes unavoidable. If visitors once walked the earth, where did they go? And, more importantly, will they return? If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and choose your next video. See you in the next video.